Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our annual meeting. My name is Rebecca Lee, and we're delighted you could be here. We still have a few people joining, so we'll start in about 1 minute. I can see a number of people are just joining us right now. Just a few administrative items. So this event will be recorded, and the recording and slides will be shared after the meeting. If you have any questions, please post those in the Q&A section. We'll respond to your questions in the Q&A section that will follow each of these sections. All of the participants will be muted, but we will have a time at the end of the meeting where you can be unmuted and turn on your camera. So let me just briefly overview the agenda for you. We really have a terrific lineup for all of you during our agenda. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just told that you can't hear me. I'm sorry. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So I see we have a terrific lineup for you. Let me just preview our agenda. So our first panel after opening remarks we have Dr. Murray Stewart, our Vivli board member, will be kicking off our first panel and be speaking with Dr. Ferreira about his work, which has been highly impactful in the area of rheumatoid arthritis. We have several data contributors from Pfizer, J.R. Maloro, as well as Catherine Tucker from Roche. So that'll be an interesting discussion that will be lining up the data contributors as well as the researcher, Dr. Ferreira. Secondly, we have panel 2 that will focus on some key funders of trials as well as their policies. So we'll be hearing from Dr. Barbara Beerer, who is one of Vivli's co-founders, as well as from the MRCT Center. And she'll be talking from, we'll hear from key funders from the NIH, Helmsley Charitable Trust, Gates Foundation, as well as the Wellcome Trust, and some of their key funder policies and how they impact the area of data sharing. We'll then wrap up from panel 3 from Steve Kern from the Gates Foundation and from a number of key panelists on how we look to build a data sharing ecosystem. We'll then close with closing remarks and recognize some of our key members. And then we hope you'll stay on for a virtual networking session. If that allows you some time to get some questions answered, network with speakers and panelists more informally, as well as with each other. So what I'll do now is really look forward to giving a very short update on where Vivli is now, where we're going, and a short update on some of our key projects. Shown here is a snapshot of our most frequently searched terms on Vivli. This includes some disease terms, some outcomes, as well as a few drug names. This really demonstrates the diversity and breadth of the community in which we serve. It's not surprising, perhaps, that coronavirus is our most popularly searched term given the times in which we live. We also see Alzheimer's disease, breast cancer, as well as a few other drug names. We see CAR-T coming up this year. So this is quite interesting. And so we'll see a through line as I present some of these other slides on where some of the popular terms as well as diseases are in this last year. And we've seen some evolution in terms of what diseases are most frequently or popular in terms of the trial inventory for Vivli. So let me give you kind of a broad perspective on where we've been and where we're going for Vivli. So by the numbers from launch to today, we are now about a little over 3 years old. We have over 6,300 trials that are being shared on Vivli, and that represents about 3.6 million participants. So we have almost tripled the number of participants that are being represented on Vivli. So the 6,300 trials represents 3.6 million participants from over 100 countries. We now have 38 what we call institutional members that have pledged their data on Vivli. So I'll give you a view into who those members are and in just the next slide. This slide represents our institutional members. So you can see that they are members from large pharmaceutical companies as well as smaller biotechs. And they represent both US, European countries, as well as members from Japan, for example. Not only do we have data contributors from industries, we have a strong contingent there, but also from the academic side, so members of the NIH, other platforms that share data in of themselves, as well as a number of foundation members that also pledge to that their grantees can share data through Vivli. We've seen quite a steady increase in submitted proposals for data in the Vivli platform. So some interesting statistics is a year-on-year metric. So we've seen almost a doubling from last year to this year. So a little bit over 200 proposals last year to over 400 this year. There's been almost the doubling in the number of submitted proposals that we've gotten into the Vivli system since last year. So if we look at what we call our year-on-year growth, we've had, since last year when we last met, we had what we call 217 proposals. If you look at the circle on the left, and now, as of today, we have over 400 proposals that have been submitted into the Vivli system. So that 400 proposals represents 1,500 trials that have been requested in our system. So about 25% or about a quarter of those proposals represents requests for more than one trial, or more than one sponsor. So we call those multi-sponsor requests, spanning more than one member being requested. And that represents we also have had over 200 data use agreements that have been signed. Another metric we look at in terms of year-over-year growth is how many participants data have been accessed. So data has been accessed from over 816 participants from over 970 trials. So that's also a steady growth from year over year. So last year we had about 370 trials that were accessed. So that's either from downloading the data or from accessing from our secure research environment. We've also had healthy increase in number of public disclosures or publications. Last year we had 7, and this year it's over 40. The other thing we look at is secondary analysis. So researchers themselves code the types of analyses they are conducting on Vivli and when they put in a request. And one thing to note is more than one reason can be selected by researchers. So the most often coded reasons are either new research, participant level meta-analysis, or confirmatory research. We do see a smattering of other reasons, such as preliminary research, supporting a clinical trial design, or either training or testing. When we look at the areas that are covered by our 400 proposals, they range anywhere from artificial intelligence to vaccines. Just want to call your attention to some of the more popular areas that are now being requested. So clearly oncology and urology are, as well as gastroenterology, are really highly requested areas. We do see infectious disease coming along as well. But about a quarter of our requests, or 1 in 4, are coming in looking for oncology data, and the close second would be neurology. So focusing in on that oncology theme, how to read this chart is the x-axis is in years, the y-axis the type of cancer, and each bubble represents one trial. The size of the bubble is how large the trial enrollment is. So one thing to focus in on is if we look at the green bubble that represents breast cancer, and the grayish bubble in the middle, it represents non-small cell lung cancer. We can see that we have lots of trials in breast cancer, many of them very large, and then we also have a lot of lung cancer studies. And those are being accessed quite frequently. Those are our most popular trials, and you can see we have a large inventory of trials in those areas. So it's not surprising if we look on the next slide, as our top 40 most requested studies are indeed in oncology and breast and non-small cell lung cancer. So if you look at our top 40 studies, 16 of them are in the oncology space, 16 of them are in rheumatology, and then we have representation in cardiology, as well as other diseases like COVID, Duchenne, and others. For the sake of time, I'm just going to run through some of our currently externally funded projects quickly. Other than, our main work is sharing clinical trial data with our members, as well as supporting our users. We do have a number of externally funded projects that are very important, from platform scale-up work supported by Helmsley, or COVID Therapeutics Accelerator, funded by Wellcome. We have an Antimicrobial Resistance project funded by Wellcome, as well as working with ADDI on Alzheimer's, as well as supporting Gates researchers to share trial data. I'm going to spend 1 minute on antimicrobial resistance, which is a project funded, and it's a little bit different data than we usually work with. Currently, AMR is thought to be a silent pandemic, and we could be looking at proactively addressing this next silent pandemic, up to 10 million deaths globally by 2050. There's currently no single platform for high quality industry data, and this could allow modeling of future resistance trends, as well as a number of other things. So we were selected to be the platform by Wellcome to manage this effort for industry surveillance data, to share surveillance data in a single platform and bridge the silos between academic, private, and public information. So we are going to be launching a new Vivli AMR platform. This is, again, separate from our trial platform, which is the main platform, in 2022. So let me just wrap up in the remaining minute that I have. Future directions for Vivli, in phase 1, in our first 3 years that just ended, we really focused on our launch to sustainability, building the inventory of data, reaching sustainability financially, and building our user base. We also sought to develop opportunities for external projects and partnerships, which I just showed you, to leverage our platform technology outside our core clinical trial data sharing. So as we look to our next 3 years, we really have a focus and vision to demonstrate measurable impact of our scientific value of the data and core technology. To successfully deliver on these innovative, implementable, externally funded projects, and of course, expand our core capabilities, while also focusing on the things that we did well in phase 1. So not losing sight of maintaining what we did in phase 1, of course. So my time is up. We very much look forward to panel 1 moderated by Dr. Stewart. So I welcome our panel 1 participants on, and Murray, Dr. Ferreira, J.R. Maloro, and Catherine Tucker.
Okay, thank you very much, Rebecca. Hopefully you can all hear me. I'll just check that my fellow panelists are also managed to get online and manage the technology. So can I get a thumbs up from Ricardo, Catherine, and is JR on as well? I don't see him at the moment. Maybe we'll give him a minute. Here he comes. Great, good. Okay, I think we're all set. So hopefully you enjoyed that update from Rebecca. As a board member, I remember the early days in Vivli and you saw that line of proposals, whereas for 18 and 19, there were less than 50. And we were thinking, are people going to use Vivli? Is it going to be successful? What are our goals for the first 3 years? And the board met recently, and it was really exciting to go through the data and also be able to start planning for the future. I think we've got plenty of members. We're in a great position. Vivli was set up naturally to share data. Everyone knew it was the right thing to do, but it wasn't just the right thing to do. It was actually all about advancing science and making a difference to patient care. And I think we're in a good position. The reason I'm excited to moderate this panel is we're now moving from proposals to publications and actually impact on patient care. So what I want to do with you is go around the panel, and each of the panel members will have an opportunity to share how they've used Vivli, and probably more importantly, not just how they've used it, what they've been able to do in terms of making a difference to patient care. So the format we're going to do is I'm going to go round one by one and invite each of the panel members to give a story, and I'm going to ask them to address 2 questions. The 2 questions are related to Vivli. Is how have you managed to access Vivli? So it's really a process question. How have you managed to get through the system? Has it been complicated? How have you overcome things? And then the second question is more important. It's really, what have you actually learned by using Vivli? What have you been able to advance either technically, scientifically, or an impact on patients? So that's the format we're going to do. We've done a few of these panels before, and a lot of the feedback's been is many of you listening want to ask questions. So the first 30 minutes will be with the smaller group, and then hopefully technologically we'll be able to take questions from the larger group at the end. So I'm going to start with Ricardo, who's from University of Coimbra in Portugal and has done a lot of work in rheumatology. So welcome, Ricardo, and I'll hand over to you to address the questions I posed.
Thank you, Murray. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or even good evening in some places. It's a pleasure to be here sharing my experience with Vivli and how we changed, we can say also my scientific career. So I'm a registered nurse and scientist working at the rheumatology department in our hospital. And I completed my PhD 2 years ago. And when doing the PhD, we planned different studies. observational ones, collecting data in our department, using data from registries in Europe, but we also planned to use data from randomized controlled trials from different sponsors and drugs, doing a systematic review of trials using biologics, immunosuppressive agents, we call it biologics, and collecting radiographic data. So starting on the first question, we took more than 3 years to achieve the first publication. And we started before Vivli was set up. So we need to have a project and then look for the different contacts that we need to reach out from each company using different websites with different systems. And also we need to adapt our proposal in different ways because a sponsor required some specific details in the statistic analysis plan, gave us a limit of words for background, etc. When we move to another, it's different requirements. So we started by that way, and we were able to obtain data from 4 different sponsors. So I don't need to mention that to assess the data from each sponsor, we need to use a specific internet browser, a specific application to manage the security of the access, etc. And different processes were in place to access that data. Near to the end, we were informed that the platforms would change, and 3 of the sponsors moved into Vivli, and the sponsor moved into a different system. So it was very easy to see the change, and now Vivli facilitated the overall process because we have an interlocutor between the scientists and the sponsors, and the communication was much easier. Also, the access to the data was much easier. And to give you a specific information about that, for instance, we started with 11 trials, but we were able to obtain data from the 11 trials, but when doing secondary analysis or analysis requested, for instance, by the editors, we only pursued with analysis with the 8 ones that moved into the Vivli, because the effort to obtain further analysis in the other ones was much harder. But we can discuss other of these technical questions later on. Now focusing on how this access to data changed our field and also other fields. As mentioned, the disease of interest of my group was rheumatoid arthritis, which is a systemic disease, mainly focused on the joints. And in the last 2 decades, great advances occurred in the field, and very powerful drugs are now available who are able to stop or halt the joint damage progression. However, we felt that there is still a big unmet need regarding the patient's perspective, because despite the patients are now have the inflammatory process under control, they still report high levels of pain, fatigue, psychological distress, social participation. And we were interested to change this and to know the reason for this. And the reason we found was that the disease management was and still is very much focused on the inflammatory target, on the disease process, on the physician's target, the ones that is able to be changed with drugs. And we thought that this should be changed into a more multidisciplinary approach. But before we reach that, we need to study how the patient perspective is currently involved in the definition of remission, which is the target of the physician. Because if the patient goes into remission, it's more likely that the radiographic progress stops. So our interest was in analyzing the criteria of remission in rheumatoid arthritis, which includes overall 5 variables. One is the number of joints that are swollen, the number of joints that are tender, the inflammatory level in the blood, which is the C-reactive protein level, and it also includes 2 other criteria: the patient's perspective from 0 to 10 on how much the disease affected his life over the last week, and may also include the physician's perspective. And our hypothesis was that we should not include the patient perspective in the composite definition that is used to guide immunosuppressive therapies. But this is a very controversial statement, because we don't want to disregard the patient, but have a different inclusion of their perspective. But we first need to prove that removing the patient global assessment from the criteria would not impact the accuracy in the prediction of radiographic damage. So the slide that we are seeing, I'm not sure if we have slides before, 1 or 2 maybe. And do we have another one before that? Yes. So basically we started to show in the 11 trials we were able to use with almost 6,000 patients, that in fact 33% of patients achieve remission during the first year, which is a lot, which means that the remaining 77% would require an increase of medication according to the current treatment guidelines. However, we have 19% of these patients that failed remission solely because the patients gave a score of disease impact above 1, and in many cases 4, 5, or until 10, even when the inflammatory markers were indicating no signs of inflammation. So these patients for us are at risk of immunosuppressive overtreatment, because what they need is not an increase or a change in the immunosuppressive drug, but they require other adjunctive therapies, pharmacological and non-pharmacological. So in the next slide, we were able to compare the radiographic progression between the 2 groups, the one that fulfills the 4 criteria, including the patient global assessment, and the group of patients in near remission, in patient's perspective, near remission, because the patient perspective is the only reason to not fulfill remission. And we observed that about around 80% of patients in both groups had a good radiological outcome, so no progression in joint erosions or space narrowing, etc., with a slightly better, but not statistically significant better result in the 4-year remission. Then we compared the accuracy of prediction of the 2 concepts. The one looking only at the current remission definition, and we were surprised with a very low accuracy, which means the sum of true positive and true negative of only 41%. But when removing the patient global assessment, and if you can turn back, we observe that removing the patient, in fact, increase the ability of predicting good or bad radiographic outcome. Still a poor prediction around half of the patients, but the most important was that it was better. And this has been received with a lot of interest in the United States and also in Europe, and lot of editorials and scientific letters have been written about this discovery, which might affect not only the field of rheumatology, but also other fields in chronic diseases such as neurology or others.
Great.
And I think that I can stop now and hear.
Okay, thank you, Ricardo. So maybe one question for me, and then I do want to spend some time with Catherine and JR. So you said there's been lots of editorials written. Do you think this will result in a change in clinical practice? Will there be adoption guidelines related to the 3V versus the 4V?
Yes, thank you. I follow the number of citations, and I always look at the papers that are citing our research. And I see that the concept is well accepted by different groups in different countries. However, changing the guidelines may be somewhat more difficult, because then we also need some political agenda to change the current status. But I believe that if the guidelines are not changed nowadays or in the current or following year, in 5 or 10 years, I'm sure that they will be changed based on this and other continuous research that we are pursuing.
Great. Okay, thanks, Ricardo. So I think it's a good example here in the field of rheumatology, where a meta-analysis combining the data from the different studies using Vivli's database was achievable. And then it's good to see this translate into some clinical findings that will hopefully be adopted as we move ahead in this field. So I'm going to change and go over to Catherine now. So Catherine Tucker is Data Privacy Technical Lead in Roche. And Catherine, it'd be good to hear your perspective on working with Vivli and what you've learned through the process.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak today. I thought I would reflect a little bit the journey we've been on, and it fits quite nicely with what Dr. Ferreira was saying about the previous platforms that we were part of. In 2013, Roche published its data sharing policy. And we were very fortunate that this had endorsement from the CEO of Roche and strong advocates in our biometrics global head. At that point, there was no real mechanism for us to share data in a sort of systematic way. Of course, companies have always shared data as part of collaborations, but not in a kind of a formalized way, if you like. So we actually spent a lot of time collaborating with GSK that year and then other companies to look to stand up a platform that might start to enable sharing of individual patient data. And I think another really important part that then also became part of some principles that were published by FPIA and PhRMA, the industry bodies in the Europe and in the US, was about being transparent in different ways. So what I mean by that is not everyone wants to access individual patient data. At the very least, we should be publishing protocols and results on websites such as clinicaltrials.gov. We have a commitment to share regulatory documents, and now via regulators such as EMA and Health Canada. And our ongoing commitment to publish as well as the individual patient data, which is a sort of fairly niche kind of request, if you like. I think a really important part that was part of that website that we set up with others, which was clinicalstudydatarequest.com, was having an independent review panel as part of that, which we know is also part of Vivli, and really trying not to spend too long trying to make it perfect, but just trying to get something off the ground. But with a full accepting that, you know, there's probably better ways. And in fact, the overall vision right at that beginning stage was that we would want to eventually work with a kind of trusted third party, such as what became Vivli in the longer term. I think another part of that has been forging a lot of different connections across pharma. It's something that in my previous roles as a statistician, I hadn't really seen to that extent, but also with academia and other industry bodies. Fuse is one, Fuse with a PH, and statisticians in the pharma industry as well. So, I mean, why do we share data? I mean, we've heard a really fantastic example there. I mean, overall, I think it's something that in the last 8 to 10 years has now become totally the norm. It has the potential to benefit society. It has the potential to benefit us as the pharma industry, and also in terms of transparency of regulators and the decisions they make and the data they review, and potentially, hopefully, increase trust in the pharma industry as well. It could also enable researchers to work on things that perhaps aren't the top priority for pharma, and sort of serve as a sort of virtuous circle in that way. And it can ultimately lead to additional collaborations. And one of the things we found at Roche is that it's actually been very instructive and informative for some of our thinking about internal reuse and sharing of data within the company, because slightly strangely, the external world sort of came a little bit before the thinking about our own reuse of data and what the potential is there. I suppose one of the questions was about challenges. So, I mean, it would take me all day to probably talk through all the different challenges we've overcome, but I think trying not for perfection, as I mentioned, a need for dedicated resources to facilitate this. This isn't something that comes for free, and at the beginning, finding, preparing, liaising with other companies and with researchers all takes time and effort. Defining when and how data will be shared. We don't want to jeopardize a regulatory process by sharing data before it's gone through that process. So, you know, when in that life cycle is the right time. I think as well, things like how do we define de-identifying of data or anonymization of data in this particular context? And is this something we can standardize across companies? There was an initial concern that hasn't proven true, was that most, if not all, requests would be about trying to replicate analyses or somehow show analyses were incorrect, or from lawyers, insurance companies. And I mean, none of those things have manifested. And in fact, I remember an early look at CSDR, the original platform, and I think something like 2 out of the first 100 were about replication. Most of the rest of it was about new research, or as Rebecca's slide showed earlier, kind of looking at certain facets of the results and trying to explore subgroups or some other findings. So we're always striving to become more efficient in the way that we handle requests. We moved to Vivli in 2020. We've had a large number of requests, a lot of interest in our data, which is really fantastic. And I think in terms of the question about, you know, how do we find interacting with the system? I mean, I think one of the advantages is having that trusted third party take on certain activities that in the past we were handling ourselves. So I think when you in particular have a multi pharma request, that was very challenging. We'd have to sort of define who was the lead between us, and yeah, and I think some companies were probably better resourced than others. So I mean, I think in terms of some challenges we're still working on, I think actually much of the focus till now has been often on the process of the sharing. But of course, as we've all been saying, the point of it is the insights that you glean, not the sharing itself. So I think having more of a laser focus on the insights and what they lead to is really important, and meetings like this are really going to help. I think another challenge we have that I'm sure is shared in other companies is clinical trials are not just the clinical data, which is the focus primarily when we started CSDR and then moved to Vivli. There's many other data types that, of course, are generated, genomic data, images. And so it's about a conversation about, well, how do we share those at the right time, whilst balancing the ability of our internal researchers to be able to access and use those in a timely manner as well. I did also think about the sort of question about patient care. I mean, I can't comment in my role about patient care because I don't really interact with patients, but I would say I kind of, talking to colleagues at Roche, I came to a similar conclusion to how Dr. Ferrer was talking about, his research and what it might lead to. So my assumption is that publications in themselves, whether they're due to sharing of IPD or any other publication, are unlikely to directly lead to a change in something straight away, but it will really be about those publications being discussed and probably raised. I saw on your bio that you're part of EULAR, so there may be some proposal eventually via that body. And ultimately, pharma companies aren't the ones who, decide these things. It's driven by those bodies and by regulators. So if we're talking about the example of changing an endpoint, perhaps it will be added as an exploratory endpoint initially. And then eventually it may become part of a change to clinical trial practice. But I don't think it's going to be something that is a direct line, and it certainly probably won't happen overnight. But I suppose to sum up, these kinds of publications, together with all the other publications that go on, are a really crucial part of drug development. And so it's really interesting and nice to sort of think of it as a virtuous circle that can then feed back in the long term into how we develop drugs in a better way.
Great, thanks very much, Catherine. Maybe just one question for you. You touched on that pharma companies collect more than just the pure clinical trial data. There's a lot of discussion around real world data. Is that something that you think Roche and other companies should be considering putting on Vivli, and that Vivli should be thinking about real world data?
Well, I suppose there's two types, if you like. There's real world data observational trials that pharma companies may run, which could be shared. But the majority of real world data that we access at Roche it's not our data to then share. It's accessed from other companies such as Flatiron or other databases that you can buy in, or they are coming from partnerships with hospitals or other universities or institutions. So a lot of those data are not ours to share. So I suppose then maybe the broader question is, whether those institutions have their own kind of ways that they generally share data. But if it's a model of monetization, then it's probably unlikely that they would share them on a Vivli, because that's their business model. So yeah, I think it's certainly real world data is certainly a big part of a complementary part to clinical trial findings as well at Roche. But the sharing part of it, I think, is a slightly more complicated scenario, perhaps.
Yeah, but something I don't think we should avoid. I think something interesting for a discussion for the future, maybe. But yeah, let's turn to JR now. So JR, you've got an exciting job. You're head of global data dissemination at Pfizer. I'm sure you're very busy. But it'd be good to, thanks for taking time to join us. It'd be good to hear your perspective about Vivli, what you've learned, and some of the challenges you've overcome.
Thanks, Murray. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, fine, thanks.
Great. Well, I'm pleased to say that Catherine has just delivered my entire presentation. So thank you, Catherine.
Sorry.
No, I'm admiring how similar our journeys have been. So first of all, I don't have any slides prepared today. That's very un-Pfizer of me, but I thought I would just speak from our experience. So thank you, first of all, for having me as a panelist and representing Pfizer. And my job is global data dissemination and transparency. So that's inclusive of our regulatory obligations through clinicaltrials.gov and NUDRA-CT. It's inclusive of our transparency reporting, so Sunshine in the US and similar laws and codes around the world. It's our publications teams and publications management at Pfizer, and then our clinical trial data sharing. So my role is to think very holistically about how Pfizer's sponsored clinical data are leaving the door, as it were. Pfizer is a founding member of Vivli, and so our journey follows a very similar path to Catherine's presentation and the Roche journey. Also in 2013, or since 2013, like Roche, we've been sharing participant level, patient level data, first through another system, and since 2018, I believe, through Vivli. And so I was looking back at that journey to try to characterize that, because at the end of the day, the question on for this panel is about how we're turning proposals into publications. How are we disseminating data? And this is very near and dear to my heart. I think maybe that's why I was chosen for the panel, because I'm a publications planning professional. I've been in publications, medical publications, for more than 20 years. So to me, how we share data matters, and typically, we want to look at through presentation at scientific and medical congresses, but also the gold standard peer-reviewed publications. And I'll speak to that more in a minute, but just looking at our journey. So we've been tracking our data sharing requests and how they've flowed through Pfizer since 2013. And, since the beginning of that journey to the present day, I would say that our success in producing publications has been mediocre. And I'll be the first one to be our critic here. We've received 195 requests over the years. And out of those requests that have matured all the way through data sharing, only 46% of those have yielded a publication. Publication being defined as an abstract, a presentation at Congress, or a peer-reviewed publication in a journal. So to have a yield of 46%, to me, though we've shared a lot of data, if the data are not in turn made available to other researchers and ultimately impacting research and patient care, then one wonders if we've fully realized the impact. Now, fast forward to our relationship with Vivli. We've done a lot to not just join the Vivli family, but we've taken on a lot of continuous improvement at Pfizer. As one can imagine, it's very difficult to wind your way through Pfizer with any sort of request, never mind requests for data that might be several years old. So when I came on board a couple of years ago, it was a very arduous process, and so we were looking to streamline our triage mechanisms and how we make a decision and how quickly we can make a decision and share data. But also, we want to make sure that we're sharing that our expectation or our hope is that our researchers are in turn publishing those data. So I'm happy to report that I looked at our current slate of requests. And of the current slate of requests, in our current status report from Vivli, I'm happy to report that 78% of those have a publication in development. So, that historical figure was a little bit disappointing to look at, but knowing that, really 4 out of 5 have a publication either planned or in development of the data requests that are in our queue today, we've definitely moved in the right direction. Thinking about my role and our role at Pfizer and some things that I'm very excited about, we're at a moment at Pfizer where we're rethinking everything. And I think COVID has caused everybody to rethink everything, not just how we work, but what we do, how we do it. and certainly being, at a company that's been involved with some very exciting developments, has caused us to rethink how we do everything, how we share data, what is shareable, and when. And so, I think in my role about not just data types that can be shared. And Murray, that was a great question. It's one that we've wrestled with about, real world data. But, I also think about who we want to share with. And, through Vivli, we reach researchers and healthcare professionals. But we also think about our participants in our trials and how we're sharing data with our participants, with medical journals who are increasingly requesting data, either in aggregate or sometimes even in patient level form. Regulators, of course, are paramount to our data sharing picture. Other sponsors, sometimes we're in consortia where we're sharing data with other sponsors, and that is for the good, not of industry, but for the good of research. The public, demanding more and more transparency around our data. And then I was very pleased to hear Catherine mention this, and I know, it may sound self-serving, but it's not. Secondary use for other teams within the company is an important component of our data sharing. As you can imagine, Pfizer's a big enough company that sometimes one team may not have visibility to another team's work. So in terms of challenges, Murray, you asked about challenges. And I think Catherine, again, touched on some of these very nicely, but our guardrails in terms of data sharing are about, making sure that we never want to jeopardize a regulatory submission. And increasingly, the other guardrail that we're discussing quite a lot is privacy. We think about some of the data that we share through clinical trials historically, big trials, big patient populations, and large Ns. But we're also a company that has an oncology business unit and a rare disease business unit, 2 of our 6 businesses. And our oncology trials and our rare disease trials very typically have very small numbers of patients in those trials. And so, that's even with the reviewing our informed consent and our anonymization processes and procedures, we still do look very critically at the challenges around sharing data, either in aggregate or patient level, when we have a trial of 10 patients, or recently an example of a trial that we looked at that had 3 patients, and the possibility of re-identification. In that 3-patient trial, one of those was a pediatric patient. So we have to look very carefully at ensuring that we're not revealing something that was unintentional. And we work very closely with our legal team to understand what the possibilities are for data sharing. But we are at a moment where we are, as I said, re-examining everything we do, how we do it, what we share, when we share it. We are in the process of building and expanding a centralized data sharing team, so I'm very proud of that. We're also on the cusp of making some changes officially and formally to our policy, so that we are regularly preparing to share rather than reacting to requests. And so that's very much a change in our data sharing posture, something that I'm particularly excited about, because right now a request comes in and we have to wind our way through and figure out if we can and then put the data through the proper processes to share it. In the future state, we're going to be in a position where we'll be prepared to share data sooner. And we will, in our future state, and it'll take us a bit to get there, but we will be preparing our data as part of our kind of end of study hygiene, doing your CSR and doing your publications and your posting on ct.gov. Well, part of that end of study hygiene will be preparing our studies to be shared. And so it's a subtle change, but a very important change for us at Pfizer.
Okay, thanks. So maybe one quick question for you, JR. You touched on, sharing data in collaborations with other companies. Some people think the industry is very protective and that we, GSK, Roche and Pfizer don't speak to each other, and that's far from the truth. Do you want to give an example of where there has been good collaboration across industry partners that makes a difference? Yeah,
absolutely. I think, we're a longstanding member and contributor with the IMI initiative in Europe, where we contribute, we contribute data. We also contribute colleague time as well as funding. And that's a multi-sponsor environment with a number of different projects and proposals. And also the Accelerator work, where that's a multi-sponsor collaborative. We provide placebo or standard of care data, so not the active arms of our studies, but we provide placebo and standard of care data in a multi-sponsor environment where there again, I think there's been a lot of work done over the last several years, and we've been very proud to be a part of that.
Great, good. Okay, we do have some time for some questions. Sorry, I probably should have made a slightly stricter moderator because we've running out of time, but I do want to go to the questions. So there's a question from Stephen Kern to Catherine. You mentioned that access to IPD is niche. Do you have a sense of the percentage request that Roche gets for IPD versus other elements from a trial?
I don't, but it's a good question. And what I meant actually by the niche, maybe that's not quite the right word, but I remember many years ago, some of you may have heard of Ben Goldacre in the UK, a campaigner and researcher. And it was when there was a lot of focus on the lack of both academic institutions and pharma as well, not posting in a timely manner to things like clinicaltrials.gov. And he was saying, forget about IPD sharing. This is much more important that you know that a trial even happened, let alone the IPD. Anyway, I don't know, because one reason I don't know is that we've got separate groups in Roche who deal with the requests for documents and the requests for data. And obviously that's going to depend on the purpose of your research and what you intend to do. But I would, one of the things we've talked about in the past is probably a good idea is to first access written documentation about the trial to understand, is your research proposal actually possible? Does the trial design lend itself to the things you want to do? If you go through the whole, we've had people in the past go through the whole rigmarole of accessing the data and then they realize, actually, this isn't, I can't understand the data, it doesn't meet my needs. So yeah, I think accessing probably documents first is a good idea.
So any other questions? If you can write them into the Q&A and I can share them with the panel. So I'll give maybe people a couple of minutes.
Murray, while we're waiting, may I make another comment?
Yeah.
So I think there was a great point or great question about from Catherine to Ricardo about, okay, so we've produced a publication. Is that enough? And can we demonstrate that there's an impact on patient care? Certainly it's difficult to draw a straight line from one to the other, but something that we're using increasingly at Pfizer is called altmetric. And this is not in any way an endorsement or commercial, but it's something that our publications group uses to understand the impact of an individual publication, because we've found that journal impact factor is simply a measurement of the popularity of a journal, and there are many factors that can confound that number. But the altmetric score is assigned based on the number of citations, but also things like tweets and other measures that try to measure the impact of an individual published paper. So it's a great tool for contextualizing and understanding things that may have a large impact. It may not be useful for smaller work, nor will it be useful necessarily for presentations at conferences. But we're starting to think about and trying to use article level metrics to understand the impact of our work. and really, you know, not just Pfizer's work, but any work that's published.
Great, thanks, Jar. Okay, I think we've reached time. I'll need to close it up. I can start to see the other panel members coming through. I'd just like to thank Ricardo, JR, and Catherine for joining the panel and sharing their experiences. I think Vivli is in a great place. I think people are using it. They're getting proposals. They're overcoming the challenges. And for me, what's important is the integration between academia and industry, and the fact we're translating some of the sharing of data not only to publications, but actually into patient care. So thank you. And I think I'll hand over to Barbara.
Yes, thank you so much, Murray, and the rest of the panelists. It was really delightful hearing from leaders like Dr. Ferreira, JR, and Catherine. So Roche and Pfizer are true leaders in the field of data sharing. So Barbara, I'm going to hand it to you to introduce your next set of panelists, and I very much look forward to this panel. So thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you everyone for joining. I see some of us, we're still there. Now we're together. So, you know, today this panel will be focused on funder policies and practice in supporting data sharing. I think we heard this morning about the impact that sort of pharma has led in sharing their data, and the advantages of academics around the world really being able to access that data for new discoveries. It's always impressed me, and I've been in this from the beginning, you know, a journey that Rebecca and I started ages ago. It feels like, but tremendous sort of progress over time. It's always impressed me that pharma's been way ahead of academics in sharing their data. And academics, while they use the data, are a little bit more or a lot more concerned about sharing data, thinking that it may be valuable sometime in the future, so why share it now? And one of the things that we're impressed with is that funders can have a huge impact on the ability, both financially, but also by setting expectations for academicians to share data, and then to support the appropriate use of data, but also collecting that data in a way that it follows FAIR principles: findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And one of the things that I'd really like to talk about today is, what does it mean to share? How have you approached the expectation that people who collect data are stewards of that data, not owners of that data? How do you establish a data model so that in the end it is interoperable, and that you support the ability of academicians and others to use that data in a way that promotes science and public health? If anything, we've seen a tremendous increase in interest and appreciation of the necessity for data sharing across all in the ecosystem in COVID-19, but that this has started long before that. And frankly, you know, of all the advantages and things that we've talked about today, we haven't talked as much about the patient aspects of this, not only the concerns like privacy, but also the fact that by sharing data, when the answer is already embedded in the data of a research question, sharing that data makes it possible to answer those questions without putting new patients at risk. And, you know, it really does help to promote a culture where we're thinking about how to advance science and advance healthcare and public health in a way that is different and forward-looking. So with that as an introduction, I'm delighted to share the panel and to give a chance for each of the members shown here. You have their bios, so again, I want to keep the time for introductions short and in the order in which they're presented here. Let's hear sort of opening comments from each of you on the challenges you've faced, on how you've approached funder policies and support, and where Vivli has fit into that journey. So let me turn to Scott Kahn from the Helmsley Charitable Trust, Helmsley's been a wonderful supporter and colleague of Vivli from the get-go. Scott?
Thanks, Barbara. And just for clarification, I'm a consultant I've been working with the Helmsley Trust for the last 3.5, almost 4 years now. In going through what I wanted to introduce, recognize that from a funder's perspective, there are many things that I think you should think through when you want to embark upon a data sharing policy. One is just to define the scope of the policy, put in place all the processes that one needs to manage that and to help the applicants be very aware of what the expectations are, put in place things that can help them even get through the application process, understanding that contractually there are things that are there that really speak directly to data sharing. But I think that there's much more to do than that. And when things are introduced for this section, I always say that fair data is usually data, that people don't give a lot of time or don't have enough time for the interoperability and reusability. And so from Helmsley's perspective, along with putting in place data sharing policies, we really thought about this issue of interoperability and the amount of data wrangling that people normally have to do. So we actively put in support for CDISC to make sure that the standards that we could use for the disease areas, in this case type 1 diabetes, were well developed, and they had diabetes standards, but they needed to be extended significantly. And so we invested in having a common data model that could house data that was being shared. And then around reusability, we realized that reusability might, from a regulatory perspective, mean different things in the US than it does in other places. And it so happens that the two projects that we were starting with, one was in the US and one was in Europe. And so that we started the project just about when GDPR was about to be launched. We had full knowledge of what GDPR was and what its requirements were, or so we thought. And what we came to understand was that there are many issues around data sharing, not least of which is secondary use that was mentioned in the previous section, that are still being discussed how that is done, because you can either use informed consent as your legal basis for sharing, or you can use a public good. The problem is that member states haven't always agreed on exactly what public good is. It's kind of that slippery slope that you want to make sure that you're quite careful. And so what we also invested in was the time to understand how consents had to be delivered to participants, go through the process of understanding how data can be shared within the EU and outside the EU through various things that are part of the GDPR process, and kind of take it forward from there. The last but not least, we also really struggled with where the data was going to be put once it was going to be shared. And to our, I'd say, joy, we found the work that was starting up with Vivli, and we realized here was a place that would be a great opportunity to aggregate data, not only from the work that Helmsley was supporting in type 1 diabetes, but also all of the industrial work that was being shared. So having a good archival site was something that was very important. And again, we saw this as something that kind of fell into our lap. And yes, we supported it because it was at the very beginning of the project and we wanted to make sure that it could develop. I will say the one thing that is still outstanding is around compliance with policy. We've always believed that the carrot is better than the stick. We've always been supportive on the carrot side. And we just recognize that, the only real stick from a funder perspective is probably ongoing support of their research. And so that's the approach that we've taken, that we've been very supportive, encouraging, supportive, but we haven't had anything on the punitive side. And thus far, compliance really has not been a challenge.
That's terrific to hear. And we'll get back to several of the points that you made that are really critical to the panel. Let me first hear from everyone before we start that discussion. Taya Norman from the Gates Foundation will give us your perspective from the foundation. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, good afternoon. Can you all hear me all right?
We can.
Excellent. So thanks for the chance to speak, Barbara and others. I'm excited to join you here today and talk a little bit about data sharing from the perspective of the Gates Foundation. And just a little bit about me. I'm a senior program officer in global health for 5 years now, working both on data sharing for a number of years and now clinical trial review at the foundation. And what I thought I'd do with my short time is just share by way of challenges how we have looked at COVID-19 as an opportunity to really see what we can do about data sharing up front. And just a little bit about how the foundation did respond to COVID. There was a Therapeutics Accelerator stood up by the foundation along with Wellcome and MasterCard and other donors to be able to fund clinical trials for repurposed drugs. And so we really used that as an opportunity to look at our data sharing approaches thus far and see what we could do to really transform and accelerate that. And so just a couple of points I wanted to make is we really wanted to take grant making upfront and build data sharing plans into that prospectively. And so those upfront pieces are aspects about making sure that we have alignment on appropriate consent and approvals, wanting to make sure that protocols and associated documents like a statistical analysis plan and data dictionary are made available upfront at the beginning of work, making sure that we can have early sharing of the funded data. So building that alignment with our grantees as a part of our grant making to ensure there'll be digital object identifiers and that patient level data will be able to be hosted in a repository. And Vivli's been a spectacular partner in this regard. And finally, with respect to publication, in our grants upfront, established agreement about publishing in a preprint server and making sure that ultimately the peer-reviewed paper appears in an open access journal. So we stood this up very quickly in spring of 2020 while we were literally receiving hundreds of clinical study applications and sorting through which ones should be funded. And for the ones that were funded, we put these data sharing plans in place. And so that's been tremendous learning for us. And I'll just say that Vivli has been a great partner in this regard. We recommended to our grantees Vivli as a repository that should be used or should be one of the ones that could be used. And we also worked in partnership with Vivli to make the process easy. I think it's been commented that principal investigators are oftentimes very anxious about data sharing, especially early and pre-publication. And so the foundation worked, I and others on our team worked to put collateral in place of frequently asked questions that could help our grantees understand the details. We also shared guides to help them do things like put appropriate consent in place that would ensure that data sharing would be possible. And we made sure there were CROs available to help the PIs prepare their data so that it could conform with regulatory standards. And then Vivli did a wonderful job when we passed the baton to them of walking data contributors through the sharing process on their side and explaining things like there's an anonymization vendor that can help with your data and making the process much more accessible to data contributors who are busy with many other things in their work, besides making sure that that data can go to the right place. And so the other thing we saw happen as a result of doing this upfront grant making at the foundation, partnering with great repositories such as Vivli, is that data did get out rapidly. And we've seen some of the COVID-19 data be rapidly used by communities abroad to start to understand what are we learning from these data and can we combine them. And Vivli's policy of providing access within several weeks was a big part of that. And going forward, the foundation is really trying to take this approach that we put in place for COVID-19 and make it a new normal. And so that prospective data sharing plan approach that I mentioned is something that we're implementing now across a variety of investments for new data generation, including implementation science, surveillance studies, and even into spaces that the foundation cares about, such as agricultural development and K-12. And so, you know, I think in the foundation, we talk about how can you go faster with COVID. And so we really wanted to challenge ourselves in the data sharing space and wanted to share about that with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Taya. That was really also lots to come back to in terms of how you've been able to propel data sharing using this window of time to sort of learn lessons quickly. It's interesting that Gates, Helmsley, NIH, and you know, and the Wellcome Trust have been really promoting data sharing from the get-go for the last many, many years. And Gates was one of the first that had a comprehensive policy for data sharing, but the quality of the data sharing plans that came in were really all over the map. And one of the things we should talk about at the end is how we can cooperate to sort of help people develop a sense of what's expected, what's possible, and what a comprehensive plan would look like. But let me turn to Yehudi, and from the Wellcome Trust. Wellcome has been really forward-thinking for many, many years on this. Yeah.
Thanks, Barbara. So hey folks, my name is Yehudi. I'm a technology lead in Wellcome's Data for Science and Health team. And my background actually in fairness is largely around coding and code sharing and also genomic data, which of course, especially when you think about things like COVID-19, a virus doesn't necessarily have the right to privacy that you might expect a patient to have. So with that, I also want to have just a shout out to Georgie Humphreys, who I believe is at this meeting and has done a lot of important work around Wellcome's clinical trial data sharing. So a lot of what I'm saying, I hope I'm channeling her correctly and doing justice to all of her fantastic handover notes here. So yes, just looking through my notes, right, 2017, Wellcome signed the WHO joint statement on the public disclosure of results from clinical trials. And that means actually in 2018, Wellcome launched a revised policy around data sharing. And just to sort of sum up what that policy is, in like just a few quick bullet points, we expect grantees to register their clinical trials in appropriate trial registries, including a data sharing plan, to publish a trial protocol and statistical analysis plan before recruitment is complete, and also to publish the summary results within 12 months of the primary study completion date. And then after that, we have actually nicely on our website, we have reports where we talk about what we've been doing to monitor this and actually see whether or not our grantees have been complying. And what's really nice about that is it gives us a chance to reflect on what we've been doing and what people have found easier to do and what people have found harder to do to comply within this. So for example, looking back over, I think from 2018 to 2020, we can see that all of our grantees were able to register the trials, most of them before they started the trials, some of them afterwards, but it still was registered. So we know that that's an element that actually people did manage to do without too much trouble, but perhaps that we can provide some more advice or help around encouraging people to do it early rather than after they've already launched that trial. And then as some other parts of this, for example, were a little bit harder. So for example, not everyone necessarily had a data management plan, even though that was something that was required. Or out of the people who had those data management plans, we've noticed that some of the people say, well, but we're not sharing the individual patient data. So one of the things that we're actually doing, piloting at the moment, and I think Taya, Norman, you mentioned the Covert Therapeutics Accelerator, and reviewing output management plans as well. So Wellcome is also piloting, actually reviewing for successful awardees, reviewing the output management plans just to make sure that when they're in place that they are likely to promote effective data sharing and effective data reuse. So that is actually just a pilot right now that is actually in the middle of review. But hopefully in the next few months or so, we should be able to actually report on how that has gone and what our experiences have been around guiding grantees who've been awarded money on how to manage those outputs. I think that's all for me. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll return to this as well. Ishwar, I wonder if you'd like to talk to us about where the NIH is and where it's going, since you've been really sort of pushing the larger community, at least in the US, to think about data sharing, as well as things like consent and how that factors into the ability to share subsequently.
Absolutely. Can you hear me all right?
We can, thank you.
All right.
I think you have some slides, yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I do have a couple slides to kind of help keep me focused. So first of all, it's a pleasure to be here and thank you for inviting me to share about NIH's revised and new policy that that we hope will really kind of provide pointers and right guidance to, as Scott said, provide the carrot over here and not the stick in terms of why people should be sharing their data. So I'm actually a program director in the Office of Data Science Strategy and work on several aspects of fair data science and coordinate many of these efforts across the institutes at the NIH in my current role. So if you move on to the next slide, I'll dive right into what the policy itself is, which was published on October 29th. And as you mentioned, that NIH requires all researchers now, similar to all the others I mentioned, to prospectively plan for how their scientific data will be preserved and shared. And a key component of that is submitting a data management and sharing plan. And I completely echo your thoughts about over time, Barbara, how to evolve this into a certain standard and have a benchmark of what it is. And towards this point, some of the guidance and that we have published associated with the policy details of what should go into what are the components of this data management sharing plan, the allowable costs that are that people can include in that, and also being some guidance for selecting the right repository, because in the entire landscape, we published these guidelines called the desirable characteristics for repositories that take into account various factors, so that the data is preserved for the long beyond the life of the award. So those are some of the aspects that one needs to take into account when selecting a repository. And there's several other, I say, invaluable guidance points that we've published. And this is a huge team effort. As they say, it takes a village. It's been several staff across the institutes led by the Office of the Science Policy, not to forget all the comments we received from the community through the various RFIs to eventually help shape what this policy looks like. So it's really a from the community itself. So moving on to the next slide, or rather the next view of the same slide, it just emphasizes that the policy itself applies to all scientific research data published by the grantees as well as conducted by the NIH. It doesn't quite apply to non-scientific, non-research data. So, but in a sense, it kind of is a broad sweep across the entire spectrum. The next slide essentially kind of focuses a little bit on what are we really doing. Okay, the policy is there, it's easier said than done. So what are we doing to kind of prepare ourselves better for really being able to share the data? So the NIH has a overarching strategic plan for data science. And one of the goals is really focusing on modernizing the data ecosystem so that it can better facilitate sharing and the data and allow for people to implement the policy itself. So if you kind of do a couple other clicks, Julie, so that the entire slide displays itself. We have three major things that I wanted to touch on today in terms of what we're doing. One is we have active funding opportunity announcements, essentially for biomedical data repositories and knowledge bases, with the primary aim of not necessarily creating, a whole bunch of new resources, but really kind of introspecting and looking into where there are really gaps for certain data types that don't quite have a home, and encouraging and enabling those to kind of evolve over time. The second major effort across the board is supplementing existing repositories so that they can become fairer, they can kind of adhere to certain standards of the desirable characteristics of repositories, so that they become the go-to place for researchers that are generating data. In addition to that, we also have supplementary awards associated with data generators thinking about how to make their data much more conducible, compatible for submission to data, meeting certain standards of quality and integrity, so that they could be reused with the focus of reusing, making them useful and actually usable. And of course, it's between the data, the people, the software go hand in hand. So we also have efforts to supplement enhancements to softwares to support either the submissions or various aspects of manipulating and making data and the knowledge generated from that more accessible. Lastly, and this is kind of where Vivli comes into play, we're looking at various ways of the entire landscape of how to incorporate all the generalist repositories that are established where people are taking data to today. So we want to meet the researchers where they are, and looking at the overarching ecosystem and the landscape of the NIH-funded domain-specific repositories, other specialized repositories that have been there and are established, and also looking at the generalist repositories, and so that these can be kind of coexist in the larger ecosystem, supporting the relevant use cases as appropriately. And I think I have one more slide. If we go to the next slide. The other big effort is, at the end of the day, we want to kind of lower the barrier, both for data generators to take data to repositories and consumers to kind of find and discover them in the repository, so that it's a easier effort to do that. And so with that in mind, we actually currently have a request for information that's out there, and I encourage everybody to respond to that about how do you kind of more easily find and discover the data, and ask questions that may not be quite suitable for the search engines that require additional reach into the data sets and the metadata associated or some other components that are there. So it's kind of a two-factor thing. One is that there's a recognition of these things, that the repositories can kind of enhance themselves and address these things, as well as contributors are building those and adding those metadata elements while generating that data itself. And so the three major focus areas over here as part of that RFI are just the broad data set discovery, looking at cohort building, and then also general knowledge search, and kind of making sure you're building appropriate data to make it more discoverable. And I think I might have one more slide. If you go to the next slide. And so this is, I think, the final takeaway, that we want the data-driven hypothesis generation to really drive the data management and sharing plans. We want researchers to be thinking ahead about data as a future research material and not just an outcome of an experiment that just needs to be kind of thrown over the wall. So, and that's how we hope that this thought process goes in at the onset itself, and that they're incentivized in doing this because they're not just generators of data making it available, but they're also consumers of somebody else's data and being able to use it. So to kind of close that circle. So I'll pause over there and stop. I don't think I have any other slides.
Thank you. So, one of the things that's so interesting is from an academic or a researcher's point of view, we deal with many, many funders. At the Brigham and Women's Hospital, we had 1,400 funders. So, you all are the large sort of folks that can drive processes and expectations and sort of a change in culture. And you can do that in part from a funding initiative, funding, the way the data is collected, CDISC standards, if CDISC is where one wants to go, which works for some and not all, HL7 or et cetera, thinking about that, thinking about interoperability from the beginning rather than in retrospect. And I do believe that giving the community at large a forward-looking goal rather than trying to retrofit data that we've collected 10 years ago with inadequate permission and inadequate, sort of metadata is just easier. So are you all cooperating in some way? And are you helping to bring other funders along so that the expectations, what to share, as we heard about, the data dictionaries and statistical analysis plans or protocols or whatever, are an expectation to share, not to privatize, that the way that the data is collected, it will be collected similarly, that's not to be a top-down approach to the questions that are asked, but rather the way that it will be developed. What is a comprehensive data sharing plan? So I just wanted to know sort of how you're thinking about that as part of the community. Scott?
So there is another group that I think all of us participate in, and that's the Open Research Funders Group, whose purpose is really to promote open research. And I think each funder has a different take on which elements of open research are kind of most hot for them at a given time. Helmsley's focused a lot on open data. Open access has been a huge element, but there's probably 80 funders that are participating in Open Research Funders Group right now. And the whole purpose of that is to get everybody on board with this notion of open science, regardless of which, sliver or the entire thing that they want to onboard with their funding programs.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody else have a comment on that?
What I would add is, I think you're absolutely right in the sense that we need to change the culture, both from inside and from outside, actually, in many ways. And so I think one of the huge, or two things that I would call out in terms of community events that we've organized are workshops, and one through the national academies, where I think we had really a confluence of people from all different domains, including funders who participated. And we also kind of had a workshop about a year and a half ago where actually Vivli participated, about really kind of looking at the crux of data discoverability and reuse. And I think one of the major themes that emerged from there is there's a lot that can happen from the bottom up or from the repositories perspective in terms of understanding some of the common aspects that they all need to address, whether it is CDEs and metadata elements, or convertibility from one format to another of certain data types, and how do they all kind of put their heads together so the whole the workshop was kind of super exciting. A lot of the repositories have started thinking about this whole term that was coined at that workshop called co-opetition, where there's this aspect of collaboration and competition about looking at things that are below the value line that they could all put their heads together to work on, and then kind of share and reuse those components across the repositories. That's also advantageous for the depositor, because then they're kind of familiar with some aspect of, repositories, and then it makes it easier for them to make that submission over theirs.
Yeah. Yeah. Taya?
Sorry, I'm muting myself. Just to comment, certainly through the COVID-19 work that I talked to you about earlier, we were able to implement the data sharing plans in partnership with Wellcome Trust and MasterCard and the others who were a part of that effort. And so I think there was a lot of learning and mutual support there, and we're taking those lessons back perhaps and implementing them in different ways. The other thing I wanted to throw out is the Foundation's also been taking data and data sharing ideas into its Grand Challenges program, and has been launching Grand Challenges that are focused on answering research questions with data. And so a big part of those efforts, which I've been co-leading with others at the Foundation for the last several years for India, Brazil, and Africa, is helping grantees who have a good research question, think they have access to data, really to learn what the process is to access that data and work with it in an appropriate way. And so we are working with partners and funders in India, Brazil, and Africa in those spaces as well. And so sharing some of our learnings that we can get from the COVID-19 space, and thinking about how do we share that back with funders in LMICs, which is where the Foundation spends a lot of its time and energy. And how do we help grantees, new data scientists and LMICs, learn how to wrangle that data, pass our best practices on to them. So maybe that's a little bit of a sideways answer to you, but it's a different maybe group of folks that the Foundation's been trying to up-level with the learning that we've been doing as well.
Well, it also speaks to the importance of funding not only all the things we've mentioned today, but also the training, education, and professional development of data scientists who can then use this data appropriately, and where that's less dependent on infrastructure other than training and computing power. So it's a really important part. Yo, did you want to comment?
Yeah, thank you. Just very briefly, I think it might be, it's important to acknowledge also that there are a lot of grassroots initiatives that funders can embrace and do and should be embracing. So there's a lot of open scientists, open research groups that spend a lot of time and a lot of effort making sure that their work is open. And probably every time they see a funder announce another policy saying, hey, we'd like to see this from now on, every single open researcher is just happily dancing. So I just shout out to all the folks who actually drive from the grassroots level.
Yeah, and we've seen some major cooperation in the real world data space with Odyssey and others being really an international grassroots effort. But, the challenge here, I think, is if as a researcher, we have to comply with different policies, with everybody, as Scott says, having their sliver that's of interest to them, it makes it more challenging. It's easier, when you have 4 letters in HCTG, to organize them and to say, this is how we're going to present them. This is incredibly difficult work. And one of the things I think is to do some serious forward thinking about, when you have the open research funders group, are you also sort of hearing from the users so that there is some energy behind finding those common data elements? And that would also make it easier for places like Vivli.
Yeah, you definitely do. I'd say the initial focus and this is kind of building on Plan S. It's really to get the open access to not even make it a debate, to just make it be part of the way that people work always. I think open data, open source have other technical challenges, not least of which is data model and some of the different regulatory environments that data is created and how that's imposed. So I think it would be great if the open access element could be done and dusted, everyone does it, and then we can start to nibble away at some of these other challenging problems. The one thing I would comment is the whole area of data management plans. I'd say Helmsley doesn't do that well. We've tried to build on what Wellcome has been doing these forever, or that's our perspective. They've been doing them for a very long time. And it's an area that the challenge is that the people that generate data tend not to be data science people.
That's right.
And but the way you have to respond is in a data science way. And so it's that impedance mismatch that we've struggled with. We continue to look. We'd love to have a DMP that we could use, that our program directors could understand, and that our grantees could not only understand but utilize when they submit grants. So I'd say that's one of those work in progress that quite a bit more work is needed to solve it.
Yeah, but that's something that the community could do together, where there's nothing private about that. And then having a good sense of what metadata goes with the data, because one of the things that's always challenging is, as data continues, what permission slips are attached to that data rather than to the study. The days of having to go back to the informed consent, I think, should be over. We should know that for every data piece, because at the end of the time, there is a person at the end of this kind of data. Yeah. And so in the last 3 minutes, I'd like to give each of you a chance to say, if you were king or queen, what would you wish in the next sort of 5 years to see in this domain?
You want to do reverse order so that
Sure.
Barbara, I just wanted to note to you that there are questions coming into the Q&A if you wanted to answer those.
All right. Well, then nobody gets to be king or queen today. So let me just take these quickly. It would be great to hear from the funders beyond the grant challenges on their support for data scientists who analyze data.
So actually we're releasing a grant, which is to reuse data, a type 1 diabetes exercise data set that's being deposited in Vivli, and the grant is all about its reuse. So I'd say Helmsley is definitely thinking about promoting reuse of data that's been shared, which is going to obviously data science people primarily. So it's definitely something of interest to the trust.
Yeah.
I would add the same. We have several funding opportunities related to secondary analysis and data reuse. We also have many different funding opportunities across this cancer, infectious disease, and other spectrum for data scientists as principal investigators to come in to develop technologies and tools and software in the open source to kind of better analyze, so their efforts can be directly supported as independent grants with collaborative projects with bench scientists to be able to validate those tools.
Thank you.
I'll just pipe up, same with the Gates Foundation. There's an interest across all of our global health teams to pair up basic researchers with data science so that there could be more, so that data sets can be combined using data standards, and more complicated research questions that require maybe more power in the data can really be looked at in a more collaborative way. So that's a big area of work for the foundation.
Thank you. And welcome, Yo.
Yeah, so I think from our side, my team is the Data for Science and Health team. So we literally, one of the primary teams that we have dedicated towards research funding is specifically around the use of data. So yeah, we have a very specific agenda around that.
Yeah, and I just want to say, having been involved in this work forever, there are two aspects to this kind of support for data scientists. One is the training and infrastructure, and the second is sort of support for the actual research. And the third is support for making the data available in a way that's useful for data scientists. And I think all the funders have been incredibly farsighted about doing that. So I see, here's the next question. I see the link between data sharing and reuse open science and research integrity. Please comment. I think getting at the idea that, you know, one is, if the data is open, one can look more closely at whether it's reproducible rather than reusable. And a minority of requests, at least that come into Vivli, are for the purpose of validating the primary outcomes. Does anybody else want to comment on that?
I mean, transparency of data is obviously always a good thing. That's our motivation, is really subsequent science that can be done with the data. But obviously being able to understand the same data set that others have made conclusions on is always a good thing, I think, for science.
Yeah, yeah.
I just wanted to say, so we have efforts that are also kind of having researchers look at that very aspect itself in terms of research reproducibility, rather data reproduce and data replicability, and looking at the rigor of research that is being conducted. So it's definitely on the radar.
Thank you. And the last quick question is for each of the participants. So we'll do a round robin and you can be king or queen at the time. What resources do you put into sharing legacy studies? Number one, and that's looking past, and I'd love you to look forward. So why don't you answer both? And we'll start with Ishwar.
So I think that's a great question. I mean, and I think looking forward, of course, hopefully the new policy will kind of kick into effect and kind of help people share data. Looking past for legacy studies, I think it depends on the stewards, and I think there's a lot of efforts that's being put into incentivizing stewards to kind of go and look at their data associated with publications or even not associated with publications, and making them kind of usable and packaging them and making it through simpler ways. And that's, I think, where some of our use cases and exemplars come into play, with using generalist repositories across the board where they may not be a home and it's not quite available. And I think another way we're trying to do this is just from educating the community, where we are helping showcase data reuse through a seminar series that is out there, so people can come and feel excited about something that's used and then try to reuse. So that way it kind of incentivizes indirectly about data that may not be kind of exactly available today, but through that watching that, they say, oh, this might be useful, incentivizing researchers to kind of take that effort to make that data available for studies.
Yeah.
So looking at legacy data, one thing we did when we started launching the reports about people's compliance with the data sharing, we noted that, for example, 100% of the recent studies that we'd looked at had already registered online, which is great to see. But at the same time, we can't expect everyone to apply retroactively to apply newer data sharing policies, and it takes time, it takes efforts to update them. So we can't expect everyone to be 100% perfect all the way in the past forever. Looking forward into the future, one thing that I would really love to see is data sharing that is also thinking about the methods. So for example, if we have computational code that works towards producing results, and I would like to make sure that the code is shared effectively as well.
Thank you. Taya?
Yeah, just personally, in the first several years at the foundation, really focused on legacy data and thinking about the incentives to go back to our grantees who had been funded and run their studies and generated their data and published their paper, and work with them thinking about making data more available. And so I think we learned a lot by in that process of putting data sharing agreements in place after the fact, and then converting them to GDPR, which was a big learning curve for us as well. And so we've done that in a strategic way with legacy data, and in ways that I think have really helped us to build collaborative data sets that are bigger and that can answer new sets of questions and really help the global health community with really hard questions like stunting and wasting for infants and kids. And so it's an example of maybe being much more strategic about legacy data, but it taught us a lot that we then have played forward into the COVID-19 space and thinking about how do we do, the importance of doing this up front so that more can happen faster.
Thank you. Really perfect. Scott?
And just to keep it short, so on the retrospective data, we do not invest in that. Often the consents are not going to be supportive, especially on peds. They're just, it's not going to be something that's very productive. Prospectively, we're obviously going to try to do everything we can, and we are trying to improve what we're doing with DMPs, so that we'd love it if we could share in a way that was workable and convenient and scalable, share our DMPs with Gates, with Wellcome, with all funders, so that when you look at the pool, you can just get a better sense of here's the data coming online, and we could make funding decisions that kind of helped enhance the aggregate, not just in our little silo all the time.
Well, I want to thank this panel for a really wonderful set of presentations, and thank you and all of your organizations, foundations, and for the commitment to data sharing and for really pushing us to think harder, better, faster, and towards public health. Thank you. And for your support of Vivli, of course. Rebecca.
Thank you so much, everyone. Wonderful panel. I learned a lot. Thank you, Barbara.
Bye-bye.
So I turn this panel over to Steve Kern, who will chair the next session.
Great, thank you, Rebecca, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone. And this next panel is focusing on creating value and building a data sharing ecosystem. And I'm Steve Kern from the Gates Foundation. I lead the quantitative science team there in the Global Health Group, and I have the distinct privilege of having 4 collaborators as members of this panel. So that includes Philippe Garand, who leads the IDO, which is the Infectious Disease Data Observatory, Rebecca Lee, who of course you know from Vivli, Tetsuyuki Maruyama, who leads the Alzheimer's Disease Data Initiative, and Andrew Morris, who is leader of HDR UK, so Health Data Research UK. And I'll give a little bit of an overview and then turn to each of the presenters to give a perspective and an example of their own on building an ecosystem, or maybe not so much an ecosystem, but a terrarium possibly, right? So we can talk about whether the size and the scope is more appropriate for one or the other. But I think one of the things that struck me as I've been listening to the other presentations so far this morning is how much we have a coalition of the willing here among us, right? People who are really taken on this idea of data sharing or driving things forward in a positive way. But outside of this group, there's still a long way to go. And I'm reminded of the article that Danchev published early in this year from John Iannides' group, where they did a retrospective look back in the publications from JAMA, from New England Journal and Lancet to see, since the data sharing policies of those journals were put in place, how many of the articles that they published actually made the individual patient data level available openly. And out of the 486 clinical trials that they were looking at, they only had 2. And those 2 actually were from the same study, but 2 different publications. And then there were only 17 more that were in a secure repository like Vivli or Yoda or some of the other available resources. So really only 4% complying with the publisher's requirements for making the data open and available. And there's a great short editorial that Atul Butte wrote that went along with it. And he asked this question that I really like. He said, if the sticks are only getting slowly sharper, are the carrots getting sweeter, right? Are there things that we could be doing that help move people in this right direction? And I like that because Scott Kahn from Helmsley just mentioned that, their idea of not trying to use the stick and really trying to impact the carrots. And three that he mentioned are the issue of reproducibility, being able to actually validate some of our insights, create new hypotheses, and also get collateral benefits like better precision on estimates of outcomes and perhaps learning and training. And I was pleased to hear Rebecca start off of this session citing the growth of Vivli. In fact, actually, I think she identified that some of those carrots are really coming true, and that's good. And certainly J.R. Maloro from Pfizer also said similar things. From my own experience, and this is my perspective, so take it for what it's worth, I think there's three big barriers that we need to get over. The first I'll call the humility of poor data quality, right? Every one of us has done a study where we'd be embarrassed to turn over the results to somebody else to look at, okay? So we've got to get over that issue because that's one of the things I think is getting in our way. Second is that those who are asked to give haven't yet received. And that's a challenge that we have to balance out in terms of, okay, am I going to be the first to give? And then third, I think we haven't yet in this field gotten out of what, if you're a fan of the Gartner hype cycle, is called the trough of disillusionment, which happens oftentimes in technologies after the hype of their excitement. So I'll talk a little bit about that, all three of those. I think to the first issue about poor data quality, if we all kind of became a little bit more Bayesian in our view of life, and recognize that my data has to work with your data to actually tell a better story than either of those pieces could tell alone, and we might be able to actually work in the right direction in that regard. On the issue of those asked to give that haven't yet received, I'm reminded of Adam Grant's research on givers, takers, and matchers, right? He characterizes people in those three kind of classifications. And the interesting result he found is that people who he called givers, right? They give things away. They had the highest rate of success in the fields that he was looking at, that was engineering and sales and marketing. But they also had the highest rates of failures. And then most of the people that he actually characterized in his research were what he called matchers, okay? I'll give if you give, but you have to give first, right? And that's actually a classification that if you've read any of Brian Nosek's work from the Center for Open Science, he's also found too. People always say, I'm willing to give, but nobody else does, so I have to protect myself. And I think, I just heard Ishwar talk about this concept of cooperation. That cooperation is actually the people in the class of givers who were the most successful, right? They were the ones who gave, but then also contextualized their giving to make sure that they were going to get something back and receive from that giving, and had a self-interest perception on that. Finally, on this trough of disillusionment, I think the thing that we're hearing is that there's a lot of willing and able people to be able to share data. There's certainly technology making it available. But then when we try to implement it, we get in the way of not having standards, DUAs and DPAs that we all have to sign, the governance issues that become impediments. And Catherine Tucker, from Genentech in the first section asked, we should really start focusing on the insights and the process. And I want to really push us in that direction, because I think the process has actually been one of the things that's been kind of holding us up. And so hopefully today we'll have a lively discussion from our three panelists as they go through their examples and give us an idea of where we can look forward to some of these opportunities to get us out of the trough of disillusionment into the slope of enlightenment and onto the plateau of productivity, which is where we want to get to over time. So I'll kind of stop there and turn over to my distinguished panelists, beginning first with my colleague and collaborator on a number of years, Philippe Guérin from EDO, who's going to be, this is quite an international panel I'll mention. So I don't know where Philippe is. He could be anywhere from India to Norway, but I'll let him start. Thanks, Philippe.
Thanks, Steve. Well, I'm in Oxford for once, so it looks really like that today. So Yeah, I'd like to come back to your point. You know, we are here in this panel and with the previous speaker, you know, not to be convinced about the value of data sharing, but indeed it has been and it remains challenging. We started EDO actually on a malaria project called WARN, which stands for Worldwide Antimicrobial Resistance Network, and this is where we have most of our experience after 13 years, and we have assembled somehow 2/3 of the clinical trial data on testing efficacy of drugs for antimalarials. So we've got here a bulk of knowledge and know-how that we have translated into other infectious diseases. We have made a lot of mistakes and we have learned from that and translated into this other infectious disease. And I'd like to when asking me to talk about what has been successful, I'd like to talk about strategic partnership, because that has been, in my opinion, the key of our success. And what I mean by that has been that we have been working with the people generating the data and engaging them into the data sharing and the product that we were delivering. So in the context of malaria, we have done more than 50 IPD meta-analyses and one to be published in a few weeks will be with 70,000 individual patient data. So that's the largest that we have done after so many years. And it has been possible because we knew the people who were generating the data. We were engaging and agreeing with them on what we wanted to do, and they were then willing to share the data. And so on the basis of that model, this has been applied elsewhere. And I'm going to give two examples on COVID and on visceral leishmaniasis. So COVID, although a lot of people have been talking about data sharing, it has not yet happened at the scale that we would have liked to see. But in the context of longitudinal data and with a strategic partnership with ISARIC, which is a network which was established before the COVID pandemic, we have been able to promote a standard and disseminate that standard across the world. And to date, we have assembled somehow with 43 countries, as far as I recall, and about 500,000 individual patient data, longitudinal data from a very large number of hospitals. And we are doing IPD meta-analysis in partnership with ISARIC. Now, it has happened because ISARIC had that network in place before the whole thing started. Doing that after the fact would have been either a lot more difficult, if not impossible. So just to stress how much this strategic partnership is key. And then the second example I'd like to talk about is visceral leishmaniasis, which is one of these neglected tropical diseases which affect the Indian subcontinent, East Africa, and a bit of Latin America. So in that context, a few less partners to deal with, but actually, yet again, not a spirit of data sharing. It's very new for them, and we have been working with them for the last 4 or 5 years in engaging them into, if we were to share the data, what could be the question that we could answer. And on the basis of that, we have developed a research agenda with them. And actually, because they were part of this effort, they were the one driving and say, well, no, I can't not share my data because this is exactly what I would like to see. And so it's not tricking them, but it's really making them part of this effort and not, saying, give your data and by magic something will happen. And I'd like to say that here there is a clear translation in the context of visceral leishmaniasis, because we are working very closely with the Drug for Neglected Disease Initiative. They also are part of this initiative and this driver of the research agenda. And they are telling us this is the question that we want you to answer on historical data that will help us in the future drug development. And so the pathway is really up to from A to Z completed. And yet again, I think what has been a strong point of that has been this engagement of the data contributor or the future data contributor. Over.
Thank you, Philippe. That's a really nice examples that you gave, in particular of the engagement of the generators of the data, who oftentimes feel left out in this process if they're not worked with appropriately. I'll go next to Rebecca, who will give us some perspectives from Vivli.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to speak for a moment on how we work in the data sharing ecosystem. So we work with a number of entities that are independent platforms, repositories, or data sharing systems, and Vivli makes them more discoverable. So for example, we work with Yoda, Johnson & Johnson's platform, EDO. We've recently partnered with Philippe and his team, ADDI, Project Datasphere, BioLink, NIAID, which are parts of NIH, and we've partnered with them successfully. So what this means in many cases is we redirect users that might find their studies on Vivli, and also data can be integrated with other data contributors on Vivli. So I would say that's my answers to how we really work together in this data sharing larger ecosystem or terrarium, like Steve had mentioned. I'd just like to spend one moment on just very practically what we see as barriers to data sharing in general, in particular to academic data sharing contributors, which are very different to what we see as the barriers to industry. First of all, unlike for industry, there really is a lack of a centralized resource within a university. You know, if we look at industry, there's often one department that focuses on data disclosure, or there might be one person in medical writing that can take on that responsibility. It's centralized, or if in one person or one department. For a university, it's dispersed. There might be one person that comes to us. They might be willing, or they might be tapped by their funder to do this. And but there's really no clear process. So even for someone who might be neutral to data sharing, the reason why they end up not doing it is there's no clear process for something really, quite frankly, they're not inclined to do, or they're neutral. So, and they see nothing in it for themselves. So the carrots are not sweet enough. So if we think about anything in life, we might be neutral or slightly negative to, but there's no clear line from A to B. We would just be inclined to do the 100 other priorities we have to do and set that one aside and just say, oh, we'll do that later. So what we see ourselves at Vivli to do is we have to think about how to make it easy to go for them from A to B. We have a team that shepherds the process along. You know, Julie Wood, who's on our team, really specializes in that. And we're not just a platform. And to the extent, and we don't have that perfect, quite frankly, but to the extent that we can shepherd them from A to B and make that crystal clear, then they will say, well, it's not that hard. We can do that. But it's such a different process. I mean, it's not like we can embed ourselves in every single university and show them the way to do that. Sometimes it's how to do a data sharing plan. Sometimes it's how to do anonymization. And sometimes, quite honestly, they see that IRB as a barrier within their university, even though it's not. So they might be using it as an excuse, or maybe it's truly a barrier. In many universities, we see that they feel like they need IRB approval. So they have these somewhat barriers in place, and then they feel like at some point they'll ditch out of the process and then just not share. And that's quite unfortunate. We see them falling on one of these barriers and then just coming out of the process. I think those are things that are all overcomable. Once we move them through these barriers, then they share and they say, oh, it wasn't that bad. I don't think money is always a barrier, but at times that has proven to be a barrier. But I don't think that's the main thing. I think it's really not having a clear-cut process to get them through and a centralized resource. So I'll end there.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. And we're hearing this consistent theme throughout the morning of the advantage of being on the front end and being proactive in this effort for sharing as opposed to reactive. It's always a less painful process. So great. So now I'm going to switch over to Tetsu, who's probably leading the youngest group, if you will, in terms of time of existence among this panel, but certainly by no means any smaller in ambition on the Alzheimer's disease data initiative. So Tetsu.
Thanks, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here. We are actually at the Alzheimer's Disease Data Initiative, or ADDI, just about to celebrate our first anniversary as an independent organization. And so in a way, I think maybe we can contribute some of our experiences and what it takes to get a new organization started here. I mean, we are attempting to do precisely what it says in the tin. We are an initiative about sharing data around Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. So we're specialized, but we still have a huge community to service. And when we think about an ecosystem, when we sat down to do this a year ago, we saw a chicken and egg problem, because in order to build an ecosystem here, you need to have data. You can't do data sharing without data. And yet at the same time, drawing people in to use the data, the use of which is going to validate the contribution of it, was something that requires data in there. So really we need data, and we need people to be excited about using the data. And we've done a number of things about this, but the one that I'll highlight just for today was our kickstarting this by generating an open data science challenge. And the thought was that, with a relative minimum of interesting and relevant data, we could get a bunch of people into this community and excited about what they could do with data and show that off to the world. So we wanted to reach a global community. So we started with a relatively simple question. Using the National Health and Aging Trends NHATS clock drawing data, this is a particularly important test but simple in diagnosing Alzheimer's disease. We set up a very simple 3-class classification problem on it. And we use the NHATS data because they were publicly available. We didn't have to go through a cycle of going through permissioning those data in order for people to use them, although Mukta Fatak, our director of data science, and her team went through a tremendous effort getting those data ready to share. We built it all and then kind of held our breath, expecting maybe nobody would show up to our party. And we were really overwhelmed by the number of people and the breadth of the people who came to that community. We had ultimately over 450 users who joined our Alzheimer's disease workbench, AD workbench, as part, many of them, of over 100 teams that tackled the problem together, which also emphasizes the collaborative nature of what we can set up through our workbenches. The people who were in the challenge came from 65 different countries, and we were really delighted to find that we had people from Argentina and Zimbabwe, so we could say they ranged from A to Z. And more importantly, maybe to us, they identified themselves as data scientists or as neuroscientists, but also actuaries, geophysicists, people who were kind of used to dealing with data and had been touched by Alzheimer's disease in the way that too many of us have in our families and our communities. So, it was great. The solution to this problem is one that might potentially be useful, but honestly is not going to change the world, because that was the nature of the problem we could set with publicly available data that went out to everybody. So we see it as a great start to our community. Our dream really, and we see this as being greatly enabled by our new alliance with Vivli, is to be able to build more diverse data with growing number of people. And this we see in many ways as the carrot. The data are there for people to use. People are going to generate useful results out of this. And we hope to see that forming a virtuous circle. Having said all of that, there are all the challenges that everyone has identified to doing this. One of the things I'll just throw out there, and maybe we can talk about it later, is how to get the data that these people have generated into the community in order to generate more excitement, because the actuaries and the geophysicists, they don't have access to the peer-reviewed journals and processes that many others do. So how do we get their insights to people to generate more good science and answer more questions? And I'll stop there for now. Thank you, Steve.
Great, thanks, Tetsu. And that's a really great opportunity that you were able to take advantage of and to help catalyze in the what's in it for me perspective, because the disease is touching so many people, and so many people have a personal experience, even if they're not data analysts, that you're bringing them in and bringing that energy. So that's really great to hear. So I'll last, but certainly not least, go to my colleague Andrew Morris from HDR UK and talk about his experiences. Andrew.
Thanks, Steve. And I should say, greetings from Scotland. It's fantastic to be here. Saying that, I didn't think I'd make it because I landed at Edinburgh Airport last night to be greeted by 1,000 policemen and women. But then actually Joe Biden took off in Air Force One. So I can confirm we've returned him safely to you. So I think this meeting is prescient. I actually think Vivli is prescient because what the pandemic has shown us is the urgent need to develop and maintain the integrity of trustworthy health data ecosystems. And it's not within the power or the control of individual organizations, individual sectors, or even individual countries to deliver this. So this does require a scale of collaboration on the global scale that we haven't seen before. In my day job, I direct Health Data Research UK, which is the National Institute for Health Data Science, which aims to unite health relevant data in the UK on up to 66 million people to enable discoveries that improve people's lives. And during COVID, we've had the privilege of working in partnership to link EHR data, viral genomic data, behavioral analytics data, cohort data, trials data, to really shine a light on the pandemic. For example, safety of vaccines, Guillain-Barré risk, VIT risk with Pfizer, BioNTech and AZ vaccines. In the New England Journal on the 26th of October, Aziz Sheikh, how do the vaccines fare against Delta? We worked with colleagues in Oxford through our Digitrials hub to enable data collection for the recovery trial. So I would argue if you get this right, it can really take gear research up to the next level. But we can't do it alone. We are completely underpowered when looking at things. So I think the prize is a global ecosystem, a level playing field, and a low barrier to entry. And we've had the privilege of working with the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation and Minderoo over the last 14 months to work on the ICODA project, which again aims to unite global COVID data in a trustworthy way to enable discoveries. And a lot of the principles are very familiar and resonate with previous speakers, fair data principles, leveraging a cloud-enabled multi-tenant workbench, which actually is in common with the ADDI initiative, open research using GitHub, posting code and making it freely available. I'd like to highlight 3 things which I think will be important in our quest to deliver this. Firstly, trustworthiness. How do we demonstrate trustworthiness? And I think we need to think much less about trust and much more about how we demonstrate trustworthiness and how you give all participants, and most importantly, citizens, adequate, useful, and simple evidence that you're trustworthy. Because this will only work if people are confident in how we do things by being honest, reliable, and competent. And one model that we've embraced is it wasn't we shamelessly stole it from the Office for National Statistics. The 5 SAFEs principle: safe projects, safe people, safe places, safe data, safe outputs. So trust is a big issue. The second thing is we're doing this in the public good. So let's engage the publics in the design of the study and the governance of the project. And that's been fantastic during COVID. We had a public panel of 1,000 people who helped us design a workflow that allowed us to recruit people with a positive antigen, SARS-CoV-2 antigen test to a clinical trial within 24 hours using routine data. So how do we engage the public? And then the third suggestion, and I think it echoes Tetsu, is this is knotty stuff. And if we try and design this in committee or by policies, it makes it really hard. So the value of demonstrator projects, demonstrator programs. And that's something that I think Tia mentioned it earlier. We now have 12 COVID grand challenges in partnership with Gates and Minderoo. And one of them, working in partnership with the IPOC consortium, is now analyzing data on over 5 million births in 42 countries during the COVID period, analyzing the impact of lockdown. So I think we need to look at a new model of data stewardship. I think we do have a coalition of the willing. It is a many-to-many relationship, and it's time that we actually provide a stewardship role to actually demonstrate we can do this at scale in a very much coordination and connected way. So I'll stop there, Steve.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And that was a very nice summary, and I think really touches on a number of the other issues that the other members of the panel had discussed as well, in terms of your definition of community, which Philippe touched on a little bit, of the community of the data generators, but you're also talking about the community of the people from whom the data is generated. And I think that's always been an interesting issue for me, is recognizing this idea of data ownership and what that means. Actually, I would argue that the people from whom the data come are the owners, and the collective society are the people that are going to benefit from this analysis. So to that point, let me get to this question that Tessu had brought up when he was speaking about, how do we get this data into the community? What are the ways that kind of grease these wheels to get the data flowing? Because we certainly have all the technology solutions. I don't think technology is a problem. There are some bumps and hurdles that we have to go into. We're still spending way too much time on the front end getting data ready for analysis and actually learning from it. But presuming that we're starting to lower those barriers and get to standards, how do we get more of the data into the community and get the community into the data? Andrew, you mentioned an approach of that engaging the community directly. How do you return results to them so that they feel like it was a good, useful exchange?
So I think as we work out, if you look out with biomedicine and healthcare, other data ecosystems are far more mature and prevalent. So I think as a community, we need to look at the incentives within the data ecosystem. And a concept which I'm very familiar with is of benefit sharing. So how are the benefits shared across the ecosystem? And that's particularly relevant when a lot of sort of research certainly in the UK is when we participate across an ecosystem in partnership with industry. So I think being really clear on the benefit sharing. What we've shown is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and the ability to run studies that individual institutions are unable to run by themselves through the collective power of these integrated data sets is a strong incentive, certainly for the research user.
Thanks, Andrew. And Tetsu, are you seeing that as well? I mean, I loved your comment about your fear of setting up a party that nobody comes to, right? And then, but people came, and now after they've come, they probably are hungry for more. So how are you going to keep this fire going?
Well, that's right. But just, Steve, to address the other issue quickly, I was interested in Rebecca's observation that, it can be great dealing with pharma companies because they may have a centralized place that shares data. But what we were kind of surprised and maybe shouldn't have been to find out was that even within a pharma company, the people who own the data, as it were, and the people within that company who are going to use the data are different people, and they often don't talk to each other. So the people who've run the clinical trials are the ones that feel proprietary ownership over the data, but it may be the data the drug discovery groups or the translational science groups that say, hey, we really want to take the insights from that. So even getting them together in what might be the same building can be a problem. And so we do need these examples. As you say, the data science challenges, and for sure we're not the only ones who are doing these, raise those expectations. And now, we need to set those challenges where the outcomes are going to be something that people look at and say, this is an insight the community uses. Everybody can build on this. And we wouldn't have seen it if we hadn't opened up these data for people to be able to use. So, again, with the chicken and the egg, you can look at it either way that you want to. There's a great sets of data out there. Vivli are doing a terrific job of making data from clinical trials especially available, and that will be really important data. We found, as Philippe has said, that when we're working with people who are in the process of setting up, for example, longitudinal cohort studies, and want to share, that baking that sharing into that process from the start makes it more likely. But, frankly, those studies are going to provide data in another 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, depending on the nature of the study. So it's critical that we're able to find, particularly in the Alzheimer's field, where there's a huge amount of data that's not being used, people who are willing to make those data available now, and people who are willing to create the examples of how we can change the course of research by using them.
That's a really great observation, and particularly about using the data that hasn't been accessed. And I want to also try to interweave some of the questions from the audience as we're going along and make this a little bit more of a discussion. Philippe, just to that point, one of the questions that came up from Catherine Tucker from Roche earlier was around other data sharing models, and whether there's other models you could think about than just inviting people into your space to share data in what's essentially a closed environment. And this gets to this idea of federated analysis, and how could your data repository get linked to Tetsu's through Vivli that then Andrew accesses. And I think I'm curious about your perspectives on the opportunities for moving that forward, or the barriers.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that's really important. I mean, it's a moving target. And first of all, I think we need to all acknowledge that there is probably one recipe that would work for all. And so we need to accept that there is a lot of heterogeneity in the way people are sharing data or willing to share data. And exploring other models are certainly the way forward. I think we see some communities of researchers or scientists who are holding the data, not willing to share it to the larger world. Okay. Having said that, we can probably create an environment where, as you pointed out, it could be a federated environment where data can be in this environment, shared with other parties and linked with other parties. And I think we need to open that and not being too strict in the way we think that there is only one way to share the data and it's open and access to everyone. So let's think, I think we are in a journey whereby when we started 10 years ago, data sharing was a bad word. It's better today, but it's still difficult. I think we need to continue this education of the data contributors, generating what the carrot and generating the incentive for the people to share the data, but also allowing that in some circumstances that's going to be not necessarily obvious for them, and so creating a closed environment, protected environment, I should say, and control environment is probably the way forward to answer the question which are pressing, and not being too strict with them. Otherwise, we're going to fail delivering anything.
Yeah, and I think, and Philippe knows well that I probably started off in this area working with him as a bit of a zealot, asking for all the data to be open, and I think I've modulated my stance over time to be more of the always fair, sometimes open, right? And so then finding that right balance when it's appropriate. So Rebecca, then if I think about Vivli, you interact with all of the people on this panel of Vivli itself, right? And so is there opportunity as well for Vivli to be reaching out to the public to talk about the benefits to the public, or are you more of a behind the scenes kind of integrator of these different groups that are trying to actually work directly with the data? What's your perspective on that?
I think it's really important for us to keep our pulse on what the public thinks. We've recently expanded our external advisory committee to include a number of patient and patient advocate groups, because if we're seeing too removed from what is going on at the ground level, we really lose touch with what's going on and what people really think. So I don't see us as kind of a broker for the data. We really do reach out to to patient advocate groups, and we work directly with them. Oftentimes, they are the key to unlocking key data sets, to be honest with you, and that's what we hear, and making them available. I mean, we don't press them to do that. They just do that independently of us, and to make them available for sharing, not necessarily for Vivli, but sometimes that does happen. I do want to make a point on Catherine Tucker's question. I do see that that is a potentially good idea for rare diseases, is to have privacy enhancing technologies. I don't see that happening until we have excellent ideas for, when the data is aligned and everyone is using standardized data. Because if something is in ADDI or IDDO and Vivli or HDR UK, and if the data is not completely aligned, we really couldn't be using those techniques, if because when you federate queries out, we really need to know exactly where the data is and that it is standardized. So that is one of the barriers to using those technologies, as we've really thought it through.
Great, thanks. And I'm conscious of time, that we're drawing up on the hour, and recognizing that some of our panelists may actually have to go to other things as well. I do think, Georgie Humphrey, as we got to some of your questions through the conversation, tried to weave them in. And I'll ask this last question about just creating this, what Tetsu referred to as a virtuous circle. I like to think of it, as Andrew knows, as this, collaborative mesh net of networks of people that are working together in groups that are starting to learn from each other. Quickly, 30 seconds, what's the thing that we can start to help catalyze this collaboration across these different groups, so that we're all not having to solve the same problems, but we're learning from each other and accelerating progress? Rebecca, you want to go first? I'll let you go first this time.
To catalyze a virtuous circle, there is really not one convener of all platforms. And I hate to start another conference or meeting, so I wonder if one group would actually convene us and maybe focus on a single issue every year, whether it be standards or something, which may be dull but really important. And all of the platforms and repositories would just focus on that one issue, because there really isn't, as we've talked about this, there really isn't one convener of everyone, and to try to chip away at some of these big issues. So maybe Steve or some other group like Welcome could convene us once a year and to try to tackle them and have an action plan.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. And I think actually one of the things, maybe to Amy Nurnberg's question about the interaction with Research Data Alliance, and maybe also RDA could be a partner in looking at that. How about you, Philippe? Anything last idea of how the collaboration?
I think I'd like to stress the point of the inclusion of the people generating the data, the engagement of the community, and it could go up to the patient level. The engagement of the community is, in my opinion, critically important. The pressure from the funders, we have felt it. The pressure from the patients is not yet necessarily very visible, and I think if we could make that happening, the people who are in the middle would have to find ways, and I think there is something here that we need to continue examining and potentially exploring more.
Thanks. Tetsu?
I think the cost-benefit ratio that we've been talking about throughout the panel is something that may turn out to be unique for every set of data contributors and data users. There won't be a one-size-fits-all. This will lower everybody's barriers. This will give everybody more incentive. So maybe we need to, again, as a community, whoever can convene us, talk through examples there and try to figure out the whole set of things that might make a difference.
Yeah, I like that. And I like the image of a collaborative workspace where, you can borrow this tool of mine and this other tool of Andrew's and this other tool of Rebecca's, but you don't need our whole full toolbox. So that I think is an idea that we can go forward on. And Andrew, I'll give you the last word.
Right. Well, I want to take us all from the trough of disillusionment, because I think it's time to do. Firstly, create a sense of urgency. Secondly, successful things which scale go from 1 to 3 to 5 to all. I think we're at the 3 to 5 stage. So thirdly, to echo Rebecca, to say, let's focus on one important question that's important to society that we think that the researchers and their affiliated platforms could focus on, so that we learn by doing rather than by talking.
Great. I love that as a close. So thank you. I am a relentless optimist, even though I sometimes point out the challenges. But I want to thank the panel for their time and their participation. I think it's been a great, lively conversation. I look forward to engaging with you more in the future. And so now I'll turn it back over to you, Rebecca, for the next stage with Barbara.
Thank you so much, Steve. And I really appreciate everyone's participation today. So if I can welcome Julie back to the podium, that would be wonderful. So what I'm going to do next is just make a few closing remarks before I recognize our organizations and members. I just want to say that, I realize today we've had really the full complement of Vivli stakeholders, including contributors, researchers, and funders. I see this kind of as the three legs of the stool, all equally important. I think the only people that we're missing are probably the research participants themselves, and probably next time we should include them. I think the barriers, we've really covered the gamut. So we've talked about barriers to sharing, also challenges, but most importantly, we've also talked about solutions and case studies. And I think those are really promising for me, that we see hope in how we could move forward together as an ecosystem. So we do look forward to making the slides as well as this recording available for you and for anyone who might have missed this. So maybe Julie, if you could move forward, and I'd like to have you recognize our members. So I'll turn it over to Julie.
Sure, thank you, Rebecca. So I just wanted to say thank you to all of our members. This is a listing of our current industry members, because really without the members and all of the involvement and support and work of our members, the data sharing wouldn't happen. Many of our members spend a great deal of time reviewing requests, preparing the data, and moving things forward to kind of for that wider public good, to move forward that scientific discovery. So I wanted to thank all of our industry members, as well as our academic platform and foundation members. So, we not only do we have industry members who are part of Vivli, we also have many key academic institutions who have been with Vivli since our founding. That includes UCSF, Harvard, Duke, and Johns Hopkins, as well as our NIH platform partners. So Import, BioLink, and our newest platform partner from the NIH, which is NIAID, plus then our funders and those who support us in those data sharing efforts, the Gates Foundation, Doris Duke, and Helmsley. And then we also have the other platforms who also work with Vivli to make sure that that data is interoperable and can work to move forward the science. And I wanted to particularly call out our newest members in 2020 and 2021 since we last convened. So we just had Tetsu speak from ADDI, also Steve from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Philippe from IDDO. So we've really seen those platforms and those members move forward, plus then industry members Alnylam, Kyowa Kirin, Bristol Myers Squibb, Otsuka, and Shionogi, as well as the newest data sharing platform from NIAID, where they're sharing more of their COVID data. So just want to say thank you to all of those members and for all of their work and help and support, because together we can move forward with data sharing. Rebecca, back over to you.
Thank you so much. So if you can flip to the next slide, please. I really want to recognize our board of directors, which really helps to shepherd us in our vision and mission. Really without them, that would be very difficult. So I want to recognize them. And Mike Stebbins is our board chair. We heard from Barbara Beerer today, as well as Murray Stewart. But thank you so much for our full complement of our board members. Next, please. I also want to ask our Vivli team members if they can turn on their cameras. We are led ably by Julie Wood and Stan Newman, who Julie manages our operations team, and Stan is our director of our technical team. We also have Amrutha. Many of you are have been trained by Amrutha in the past. Catherine Darcy is located in the UK. So those of you who are in the UK might see her. Sienna has been really instrumental in managing a number of things, but she also helped pull off this webinar. Gabby is back from maternity leave. We're delighted to have her. Will is working on the IT side for us. Liz Graham is actually straddling both the IT side as well as the operations. So I think that covers everyone. I hope I haven't missed anyone, but we also have Louis Seaton on the finance side. Marsha Levenstein is our stats expert, and Frank Rockhold is our senior advisor. So really delighted to have a full complement of our teams here and behind us. So thank you to our team. Next, please. So for those of you who are still on, we will ask you, we will be turning on your cameras if you would like, but if you don't want to, that's fine. We ask you to stay on for some networking and informal discussion. Some of our panelists will also stay on and certainly ask to any questions that you would like. And us and our team will also be here so that you can meet them. I know you don't often get to meet our team in person or virtually, so I look forward to seeing all of you. Thank you.